Good morning. Remember today's under 2 hour early release, so our schedule a little different. So I'll be looking at that daily plan. Last left him, Will was introduced his new horse, Tug. So we'll see how that relationship develops. Chapter 15. Will rode Tug slowly through the crowded fairground that had been set up outside the castle walls. All the villagers and inhabitants of the castle itself seemed to be out, and he had to ride carefully to ensure that Tug didn't step on somebody's foot. It was harvest day, the day when all the crops had been gathered and stored for the winter months ahead. After a hard month of harvesting, the Baron traditionally allowed his people a holiday. Every year at this time, the traveling fair came to the castle and set up its booths and stalls. There were fire eaters and jugglers, singers and storytellers. There were stalls where you could attempt to win prizes by throwing soft leather balls at pyramids made from bottled-shaped pieces of wood, or by throwing hoops over squares. Will sometimes thought that the squares were perhaps just a little larger than the hoops that one was given to throw, and he had never actually seen anyone win one of the prizes. But it was all fun, and the Baron paid for it from his own purse. Right now, however, Will was not concerned with the fair and its attractions. There would be a time later in the day for that. At the moment, he was on his way to meet his former ward mates. By tradition, all the craftmasters gave their apprentices the day off at harvest day, even though they had taken no part in the actual harvest themselves. Will had been wondering for weeks whether he was or not Halt would conform to the practice. The ranger seemed to take no notice of tradition and had his own way of doing things. But 2 nights before, his anxiety had been settled. Halt had gruffly told him that he could have the holiday, adding that he would probably forget everything that he had learned in the past 3 months. Those 3 months had been a time of constant practice with his bow and the knives that Halt had given him. 3 months of stalking through the fields outside the castle, moving from one scant patch of cover to the next, trying to make his way unobserved by Halt's eagle eyes. 3 months of riding and caring for Tug, of forming a special bond of friendship with the little pony. That, he thought, had been the most enjoyable part of it all. Now, he was ready for a holiday and ready to enjoy himself a little. Even the thought that Horace would be there couldn't dim the pleasure. Maybe, he thought, a few months at hard training in battle school had changed Horace's aggressive manner a little. It was Jenny who had arranged the meeting for the holiday, encouraging the others to join her with the promise of a batch of fresh mince pies that she would bring from the kitchen. She was already one of Master Chubb's prized pupils, and he boasted of her artistry to anyone who would listen, giving suitable emphasis to the vital role his training had played in developing her skill, of course. Will's stomach grumbled with pleasure at the thought of those pies. He was starving, since he had intentionally gone without breakfast so as to leave room for them. Jenny's pies were already legendary in Castle Redmont. He had arrived at the meeting point early, so he dismounted and led Tug into the shade of an apple tree. The little pony craned his head and looked wistfully at the apples on the branches, well out of his reach. Will grinned at him and scrambled quickly up the tree, picking an apple and handing it to the pony. "That's all you get," he said. "You know what Halt says about eating too much." Tug shook his head impatiently. That was still a matter of disagreement between him and the ranger. Will looked around. There was no sign of the others, so he sat down in the shade of the tree, leaning his back against the knobby trunk to wait. "Why, it's young Will, isn't it?" said a deep voice close behind him. Will scrambled hastily to his feet and touched his forehead in a polite salute. It was Baron Erold himself, seated astride his giant battle horse and accompanied by several of his senior knights. "Yes, sir," said Will nervously. He wasn't used to being addressed by the Baron. "Happy harvest day to you, sir." The Baron nodded in acknowledgement and leaned forward, slouching comfortably in his saddle. Will had to crane his neck to look up at him. "I must say, young man, you look quite the part there," the Baron said. "I hardly saw you in that gray ranger cloak. Has Halt been teaching you all his tricks already?" Will glanced down at the gray and green mottled cloak that he was wearing. Halt had given it to him some weeks ago. He had shown Will how the gray and green modeling broke up the shape of the wearer and helped him blend into the landscape. It was one of the reasons, he said, why rangers could move unseen with such ease. "It's the cloak, sir," Will said. "Halt calls it camouflage." The Baron nodded, obviously familiar with the term, which had been a new concept to Will. "Just make sure you don't use it to steal more cakes," he said with mock severity, and Will shook his head hurriedly. "Oh, no, sir," he said immediately. "Halt told me that if I did anything like that, he'd tan the skin off of my backside." He stopped awkwardly. He wasn't sure if backside was sort of word you use in the presence of someone as exalted as the Baron. The Baron nodded again, trying not to let a wide grin break through. I'm sure he did, he said. And how are you getting on with Halt? Are you enjoying learning to be a ranger? Will paused. To be honest, he hadn't had time to think of if he was enjoying himself or not. His days were too busy learning new skills, practicing with bow and knives, and working with Tug. This was the first time in 3 months he had had a moment to actually think about it. I suppose so, he said hesitantly. Only... His voice trailed off and the Baron looked at him closely. Only what? He prompted. Will shifted from one foot to the other, wishing that his mouth didn't continually get ahead of him in these situations by talking too much. Words had a way of emerging before he had really time to consider whether he wanted to say them or not. Only, Halt never smiles at all, he went on awkwardly. He's always so serious about things. He had the impression that the Baron was suppressing another grin. Well, said Baron Erold, being a ranger is a serious business, you know. I'm sure Halt has impressed that on you. All the time, Will said ruefully, and this time the Baron couldn't help smiling. Just pay attention to what he tells you, youngster, he said. You're learning a very important job there. Yes, sir. Will was a little surprised to realize that he did agree with the Baron. Baron Erold reached forward to gather up his reins. On an impulse, before the nobleman could ride away, Will stepped forward. Excuse me, sir, he said hesitantly, and the Baron turned back to him. Yes, Will? He asked. Will shuffled his feet again and then went on. Sir, remember when our armies fought Morgarath? Baron Erold's cheerful face was clouded by a thoughtful frown. I'll never forget that in a hurry, boy, he said. What about it? Sir, Halt tells me the Rangers showed the cavalry a secret way across the Slipsunder, so they were able to attack the enemy's rear... That's true, said Erold. I've been wondering, sir, what was the Ranger's name? Will finished, feeling himself flush with his boldness. Didn't Halt tell you? The Baron asked. Will shrugged his shoulders. He said names weren't important. He said supper was important, but not names. But you think names are important, in spite of what your master has told you? Said the Baron, seeming to frown again. Will gulped and went on. I think it was Halt himself, sir, he said, and I wondered why he hadn't been decorated or honored for that skill. The Baron thought for a moment, then spoke again. Well, you're right, Will, he said. It was Halt, and I wanted to honor him for it, but he wouldn't allow me. He said that wasn't the Ranger's way. But... Will began in a perplexed tone, but the Baron's upraised hand stopped him from speaking any further. You Rangers have your own ways, Will, as I'm sure you're learning. Sometimes other people don't understand them. Just listen to Halt and do as he does, and I'm sure you'll have an honorable life ahead of you. Yes, sir, Will saluted again, and as the Baron slapped his reins lightly on his horse's neck and turned away toward the fairground. Now enough of this, said the Baron. We can't chatter all day. I'm off to the fair. Maybe this year I'll get a hoop over one of those squares. The Baron started to ride away. Then a thought seemed to strike him, and he reined in for a second. Will, he called back. Yes, sir? Don't tell Halt that I told you he led the cavalry. I don't want him angry at me. Interesting. All right, chapter 16. Jenny, Alice, and George arrived shortly after. As she had promised, Jenny was carrying a batch of fresh pies wrapped in a red cloth. She laid them carefully on the ground under the apple tree as the others crowded around. Even Alice, usually so poised and dignified, seemed anxious to get her hands on one of Jenny's masterpieces. Come on, George said. I'm starving. Jenny shook her head. We should wait for Horace, she said, looking around for him but not seeing him in the passing crowds of people. Oh, come on, George pleaded. I've been slaving over a hot petition to the Baron all morning. Alice rolled her eyes to heaven. Perhaps we should start, she said. Otherwise he'll begin a legal argument and we'll be here all day. We can always put a couple aside for Horace. Will grinned. George was a different kettle of fish now to the shy stammering boy at the choosing. Scribe school obviously had caused him to bloom. Jenny served out 2 pies each, setting 2 aside for Horace. That'll do for starters, she said. The others eagerly tucked in and soon began to chorus their praise for the pies. Jenny's reputation was well-founded. This, said George, standing above them and spreading his arms wide as he addressed an imaginary court, cannot be described as a mere pie, Your Honor. To describe them as a pie would be a gross miscarriage of justice, the like of which this court has never seen before. Will turned to Alice. How long has he been like this? He asked. She smiled. They all get this way with a few months' legal training. These days, the main problem with George is getting him to shut up. Oh, sit down, George, said Jenny, blushing at his praise, but delighted nonetheless. You are a complete idiot. Perhaps, my fair miss, but it is the sheer magic of these works of art that has turned my brain. These are not pies, these are symphonies. He raised his remaining half pie to the others in a mock toast. I give you Miss Jenny's Symphony of Pies. Alice and Will, grinning at each other and at George, raised their own pies in response and echoed the toast. Then all 4 apprentices burst out laughing. It was a pity that Horace chose that precise moment to arrive. Alone among them, he was miserable in his new situation. The work was hard and unremitting, and the discipline was unwavering. He had expected that, of course, and under normal circumstances he could have handled it. But being the focus for Bryn, Alda, and Jerome's spite was making his life a nightmare, literally. The 3 second-year cadets would rouse him from his bed at all hours of the night, dragging him out to perform the most humiliating and exhausting tasks. The lack of sleep and the worry of never knowing when they might appear to torment him further was causing him to fall behind in his classroom work. His roommate, sensing that if they showed any sympathy for him, they might become targets along with him, had cast him adrift so that he felt totally alone in his misery. The one thing he had always aspired to was rapidly becoming ashes in his mouth. He hated Battle School, but he could see no way out of his predicament without embarrassing and humiliating himself even further. Now, on one day, when he could escape from the restrictions and the tensions of Battle School, he arrived to find his former wardmates already busy at their feast, and he was angry and hurt that they hadn't bothered to wait for him. He had no idea that Jenny had set some of the pies aside for him. He assumed that she had divided them all up already, and that hurt him more than anything. Of all of his former wardmates, she was the one he felt closest to. Jenny was always cheerful, always friendly, always willing to listen to another's troubles. He realized that he had been looking forward to seeing her again today, and now he felt that she had let him down. He was predisposed to think badly of the others. Alice had always seemed to hold herself aloof from him, as if he weren't good enough for her, and Will had spent his time playing tricks on him, then running away and climbing into that immense tree where Horace couldn't follow. At least, that was how Horace saw things in his current vulnerable state. He conveniently forgot the times he had cuffed Will over the ear or held him in a headlock until the smaller boy was forced to cry, "Yield!" As for George, Horace had never taken much notice of him. The thin boy was studious and devoted to his books, and Horace had always considered him a pallid, uninteresting person. Now, here he was performing for them while they laughed and ate the pies and left nothing for him, and suddenly he hated them all. "Well, this is very nice, isn't it?" he said bitterly, and they turned to him, the laughter dying on their faces. As was inevitable, Jenny was the first one to recover. "Horace, you're here at last," she said. She started toward him, but the cold look on his face stopped her. "At last," he said. "I'm a few minutes late, and suddenly I'm here at last? And just too late because you've already pigged out on all the pies." Which was hardly fair to poor Jenny. Like most cooks, once she had prepared a meal, she had little interest in eating it. Her real pleasure lay in watching others enjoy the results of her work, and listening to their praise. Consequently, she hadn't had any of the pies. She turned back now to the 2 that she had covered in a napkin to keep for him. No, she said quickly. "There are still some left, look." But Horace's pent-up anger prevented him from acting or speaking rationally. "Well," he said in a voice heavy with sarcasm, "maybe I ought to come back later and give you time to finish them as well." "Horace!" Tears sprang to Jenny's eyes. She had no idea what was wrong with Horace. All she knew was that her plan for a pleasant reunion with her old wardmates was falling in ruins. George stepped forward now, peering curiously at Horace. The tall, thin boy cocked his head to one side to study the apprentice warrior more closely, as if he were an exhibit or a piece of evidence in a law court. "There's no call to be unpleasant," he said reasonably. But reason wasn't what Horace wanted to hear. He shoved the other boy aside angrily. "Get away from me," he said, "and mind your own talk to a warrior. Mind how you talk to a warrior." "You're not a warrior yet," Will told him scornfully. "You're still only an apprentice like the rest of us." Jenny made a small gesture with her hands, urging Will to drop the matter. Horace, who was in the act of helping himself to the remaining pies, looked up slowly. He measured Will up and down for a second or two. "Oh," he said, "I see the apprentice spy is with us today." He looked to see if the others were laughing at his wit. They weren't, and it only served to make him more unpleasant. "I suppose Holt is teaching you to slink around spying on everyone, is he?" Horace stepped forward without waiting for an answer and fingered Will's mottled cloak sarcastically. "What's this? Didn't you have enough dye to make it all one color?" "It's a ranger's cloak," Will said quietly, holding down the anger that was building inside of him. Horace snorted scornfully, cramming half of one of the pies into his mouth and spraying crumbs as he did so. "Don't be unpleasant," George said. Horace rounded on the apprentice scribe, his face red. "Watch your tongue, boy," he snapped. "You're talking to a warrior, you know." "An apprentice warrior," Will repeated firmly, laying stress on the word apprentice. Horace went redder and looked angrily between the two of them. Will tensed himself, sensing that the bigger boy was about to launch an attack. But there was something in Will's eyes and his ready stance that made Horace think twice about it. He had never seen that look of defiance before. In the past, if he had threatened Will, he had always seen fear. This newfound confidence unsettled him a little bit. Instead, he turned back to George and gave him a heavy shove in the chest. "How's that for unpleasant?" he said as the tall, thin boy staggered back. George's arms windmilled as he tried to save himself from falling. Accidentally, he struck Tug a glancing blow on the side. The little pony, grazing peacefully, reared suddenly against his bridle. "Steady, Tug," Will said, and Tug quieted immediately. But now Horace had noticed him for the first time. He stepped forward and looked more closely at the shaggy pony. "What's this?" he asked in mock disbelief. "Has someone brought a big ugly dog to the party?" Will clenched his fists. "He's my horse," he said quietly. He could put up with Horace sneering at him, but he wasn't going to stand by and see his horse insulted. Horace let out a braying laugh. "A horse?" he said. "That's not a horse. In the battle school, we ride real horses, not shaggy dogs. Looks like he needs a good bath to me, too." He wrinkled his nose and pretended to sniff closer to Tug. The pony glanced sideways at Will. "Who is this unpleasant clod?" his eyes seemed to say. Then Will, carefully hiding the wicked grin that was trying to show on his face, said casually, "He's a ranger horse. Only a ranger can ride him." Horace laughed again. "My grandmother could ride that shaggy dog." "Maybe she could," said Will, "but I bet you can't." Before he even finished the challenge, Horace was untying the bridle. Tug looked at Will, and the boy could have sworn the horse nodded slightly. Horace swung himself easily up onto Tug's back. The pony stood unmoving. "Nothing to it," Horace crowed. Then he dug his heels into Tug's sides. "Come on, doggy, let's have a run." Will saw the familiar preparatory bunching of muscles in Tug's legs and body. Then the pony sprung into the air off of all 4 feet, twisted violently, came down on his front legs, and shot his hindquarters high into the air. Horace flew like a bird for several seconds. Then he crashed flat on his back in the dust. George and Alice looked on in delighted disbelief as the bully lay there for a second or two, stunned and winded. Jenny went to step forward to see if he was all right. Then her mouth set into a determined line and she stopped. Horace had asked for it, she thought. There was a chance then, just a chance, that the whole incident might end there. But Will couldn't resist the temptation to have one last word. "Maybe you'd better ask your grandmother if she'll teach you to ride," he said, straight-faced. George and Alice managed to hide their smiles, but unfortunately it was Jenny who couldn't stop the small giggle that escaped her. In an instant, Horace scrambled to his feet, his face dark with rage. He looked around, saw a fallen branch from the apple tree, and grabbed it, brandishing it over his head as he rushed at Tug. "I'll show you, you naughty word, horse," he yelled furiously, swinging the stick wildly at Tug. The pony danced sideways out of harm's way, and before Horace could strike again, Will was on him. He landed on Horace's back, and his weight and the force of his leap drove them both to the ground. They rolled there, grappling with each other, each trying to gain an advantage. Tug, alarmed to see his master in danger, whinnied nervously and reared. One of Horace's wildly flailing arms caught Will a ringing blow across the ear. Then Will managed to get his right arm free and punched Horace hard in the nose. Blood ran down the bigger boy's face. Will's arms were hard and well-muscled after his 3 months training with Halt, but Horace was being taught in a hard school, too. He drove a fist into Will's stomach, and Will gasped as the air was driven out of him. Horace scrambled to his feet, but Will, in a move that Halt had shown him, swung his own legs in a wide arc, cutting Horace's feet from under him and sending him tumbling again. Always strike first, Halt had dinned into his brain as the hours they had spent practicing unarmed combat. Now, as the other boy crashed to the ground again, Will dived upon him, trying to pin his arms beneath his knees. Then Will felt an iron grip on the back of his collar, and he was being hauled in the air like a fish upon a hook, wriggling and protesting. "What's going on here, you two hooligans?" said a loud, angry voice in his ear. Will twisted around and realized that he was being held by Sir Rodney, the battle master. And the big warrior looked extremely angry. Horace scrambled to his feet and stood at attention. Sir Rodney released Will's collar, and the ranger's apprentice dropped to the ground like a sack of potatoes. Then he, too, stood at attention. "Two apprentices," said Sir Rodney angrily, "brawling like hooligans and spoiling the holiday, and to make things worse, one of them is my own apprentice." Will and Horace shuffled their feet, eyes down, unable to meet the battlemaster's furious gaze. "All right, Horace, what's going on here?" Horace shuffled his feet again and went red. He didn't answer. Sir Rodney looked at Will. "All right, you, the ranger's boy. What's this all about?" Will hesitated. "Just a fight, sir," he mumbled. "I can see that," the battlemaster shouted. "I'm not an idiot, you know." He paused for a moment, waiting to see if either boy had been anything further to add. They were both silent. Sir Rodney sighed in exasperation. Boys, if they weren't getting under your feet, they were fighting, and if they weren't fighting, they were stealing or breaking something. "All right," he said finally. "The fight's over. Now shake hands and be done with it." He paused, and as neither boy made a move to shake hands, he roared in his parade ground voice, "Get on with it!" Galvanized into action, Will and Horace reluctantly shook hands. But as Will looked into Horace's eyes, he saw that the matter was far from settled. "We'll finish this another time," the angry look in Horace's eyes said. "Any time you like," the apprentice ranger's eyes replied. That was unexpected. All right, have a good day.